Rudy's youth. In the end, she had to give it to him. He knew how to perform. A portrait of Rudy Steiner, July 1941. Strings of mud clench his face. His thigh is a pendulum long dead in its clock. His lemon lamplit hair is disheveled, and he wears a sad, absurd smile. He stood a few meters from the step and spoke with great conviction, great joy. Alle ist scheiß, he announced. All is steep. In the first half of 1941, while Liesel went about the business of concealing Max Vandenberg, stealing newspapers, and telling off mayors' wives, Rudy was enduring a new life of his own. At the Hitler Youth, since early February, he'd been returning from the meetings in a considerably worse state than he'd left in. On many of those return trips, Tommy Muller was by his side in the same condition. The trouble had three elements to it. A triple-tiered problem: Tommy Muller's ears, Franz Deutscher, the irate Hitler Youth leader, Rudy's inability to stay out of things. So this is kind of like a Rudy focus chapter. It's what he was kind of going through while Liesel was hiding Max, going through her own issues. You know, what was Rudy going through? He was in the Hitler Youth as well. How was he handling being a kid in this time, being forced to kind of be a Nazi, being trained, as kind of the future of Nazism. If only Tommy Muller hadn't disappeared for 7 hours on one of the coldest days in Munich's history 6 years earlier. His ear infection and nerve damage were still contorting the marching pattern at the Hitler Youth, which I can assure you was not a positive thing. To begin with, the downward slide of momentum was gradual, but as the months progressed, Tommy was consistently gathering the ire of the Hitler Youth leaders, especially when it came to the marching. Remember Hitler's birthday the previous year? For some time, the ear infection was getting worse. They had reached the point where Tommy had genuine problems hearing. He could not make out the commands that were shouted at the group as they marched in line. It didn't matter if it was in the hall or outside, in the snow or the mud or the slits of rain. The goal was always to have everyone stop at the same time. One click, they were told, that's all the Fuhrer wants to hear. Everyone united, everyone together as one. Then Tommy. It was his left ear, I think, that was the most troublesome of the two, and when the bitter cry of halt wet the ears of everybody else, Tommy marched comically and obliviously on. He could transform a marching line into a dog's breakfast in the blink of an eye. Okay, so they were kind of being taught to march, and Tommy Muller, because of his ear infections, he was a little bit deaf, and so he never knew when to stop. On one particular Saturday at the beginning of July, just after 3:30, and a litany of Tommy-inspired failed marching attempts, Franz Deutscher, the ultimate name for the ultimate teenage Nazi, was completely fed up. Muller drew off his thick blonde hair, massaged his head, and his words manipulated Tommy's face. "You ape, what's wrong with you?" Tommy slouched fearfully back, but his left cheek still managed to twitch in a manic, cheerful contortion. He appeared not only to be laughing with a triumphant smirk, but accepting the bucketing with glee, and Franz Deutscher wasn't having any of it. His pale eyes cooked him. "Well," he asked, "what can you say for yourself?" Tommy's twitch only increased in both speed and depth. "Are you mocking me?" Heil twitched Tommy in a desperate attempt to buy some approval, but he did not make it to the Hitler part. That was when Rudy stepped forward. He faced Franz Deutscher looking up at him. "He's got a problem, sir. I can see that." "With his ears," Rudy finished. "He can't—" "Right, that's it." Deutscher rubbed his hands together. "Both of you, 6 laps of the grounds." They obeyed, but not fast enough. Schnell, his voice chased them. When the 6 laps were completed, they were given some drills of the run, drop down, get up, get down again variety, and after 15 very long minutes, they were ordered to the ground for what should have been the last time. Rudy looked down. A warped circle of mud grinned up at him. "What might you be looking at?" it seemed to ask. So Rudy kind of defended, or at least tried to be a good friend to Tommy, to explain why he couldn't what his problem was, and it ends up getting him into trouble as well. He forces them to run, but then Rudy kind of looks at the mud in memory, no, of his Jesse Owens incident. Down, Franz ordered. Rudy naturally jumped over it and dropped to his stomach. Up, Franz smiled, one step back. They did it. Down. The message was clear, and now Rudy accepted it. He dived at the mud and held his breath, and at that moment, lying ear to sodden earth, the drill ended. Vielen Dank, mein Herren, Franz Deutscher politely said. Many thanks, my gentleman. Rudy climbed to his knees, did some gardening in his ear, and looked across at Tommy. Tommy closed his eyes, and he twitched. When they returned to Himmel Street that day, Liesel was playing hopscotch with some of the younger kids, still in her BDM uniform. From the corner of her eye, she saw the two melancholic figures walking towards her. One of them called out. They met on the front step of the Steiner's concrete shoebox of a house, and Rudy told her all about the day's episode. After 10 minutes, Liesel sat down. After 11 minutes, Tommy, who was sitting next to her, said, It's all my fault, but Rudy waved him away somewhere between sentence and smile, chopping a mud streak in half with his finger. It's my... Tommy tried again, but Rudy broke the sentence completely and pointed at him. Tommy, please. There was a peculiar look of contentment on Rudy's face. Liesel had never seen someone so miserable yet so wholeheartedly alive. Just sit there and twitch or something. And he continued with the story. He paced, he wrestled his tie, the words were flung at her, landing somewhere on the concrete step. That Deutscher, he summed up buoyantly. He got us, huh, Tommy? Tommy nodded, twitched, and spoke, not necessarily in that order. It was because of me. Tommy, what did I say? When? Now, just keep quiet. Sure, Rudy. When Tommy walked forlornly home a short while later, Rudy tried what appeared to be a masterful new tactic. Pity. On the step, he perused the mud that had dried as a crusty sheet on his uniform, then looked Liesel hopefully in the face. What about it, Sommensch? What about what? You know. Liesel responded in the usual fashion. Soccerel, she laughed, and she walked the short distance home. A disconcerting mixture of mud and pity was one thing, but kissing Rudy Steiner was something entirely different. Smiling sadly on the step, he called out, rummaging a hand through his hair. One day, he warned her. One day, Liesel. So, Rudy, ever since the beginning of their childhood, ever since the beginning of their friendship, Rudy's thinking is he wants a kiss from Liesel, and she's never gonna give it to him. For years, they're growing up, no? They're probably in their early teens now. But Liesel Good is like, I'm never gonna kiss you. And Rudy is like, one day, you will. In the basement, just over 2 years later, Liesel ached sometimes to go next door and see him, even if she was writing in the early hours of morning. She also realized it was most likely those sodden days at the Hitler Youth that had fed his, and subsequently her own, desire for crime. After all, despite the usual bouts of rain, summer was beginning to arrive properly. The Klar apples should have been ripening. There was more stealing to be done. The losers. When it came to stealing, Liesel and Rudy first stuck with the idea that there was safety in numbers. Andy Schmeichel invited them to the river for a meeting. Among other things, a game plan for fruit stealing would be on the agenda. So are you the leader now? Rudy had asked, but Andy shook his head, heavy with disappointment. He clearly wished that he had what it took. No. His cool voice was unusually warm, half-baked. There's someone else. The new Arthur Berg, he had windy hair and cloudy eyes, and he was the kind of delinquent who had no other reason to steal except that he enjoyed it. His name was Victor Schemmel. Unlike most people engaged in the various arts of thievery, Victor Schemmel had it all. He lived in the best part of Malking, high up in a villa that had been fumigated when the Jews were driven out. He had money, he had cigarettes. What he wanted, however, was more. No crime in wanting a little more, he claimed, lying back in the grass, with a collection of boys assembled around him. Wanting more is our fundamental right as Germans. What does our Führer say? He answered his own rhetoric. We must take what is rightfully ours. At face value, Victor Kemmel was clearly your typical teenage artist. Unfortunately, when he felt like revealing it, he also possessed a certain charisma, a kind of follow me. When Liesel and Rudy approached the group by the river, she heard him ask another question. So where are these two deviants you've been bragging about? It's 4:10 already. Not by my watch, said Rudy. Victor Chamel propped himself up on an elbow. You're not wearing a watch. Would I be here if I was rich enough to own a watch? The new leader sat up fully and smiled. With straight white teeth, he then turned his casual focus onto the girl. Who's the little whore? Liesel, well accustomed to verbal abuse, simply watched the fog-ridden texture of his eyes. Last year, she listed, I stole at least 300 apples and dozens of potatoes. I have little trouble with barbed wire fences, and I can keep up with anyone here. Is that right? Yes, she did not shrink or step away. All I ask is a small part of anything we take. A dozen apples here or there, a few leftovers for me and my friend. Well, I suppose that can be arranged. Victor lit a cigarette and raised it to his mouth. He made a concerted effort to blow his next mouthful in Liesel's face. Liesel did not cough. It was the same group as the previous year, the only exception being the leader. Liesel wondered why none of the other boys had assumed the helm, but looking from face to face, she realized that none of them had it. They had no qualms about stealing, but they needed to be told. They liked to be told, and Victor Kemmel liked to be the teller. It was a nice microcosm. For a moment, Liesel longed for the reappearance of Arthur Berg, or would he too have fallen under the leadership of Kemmel? It didn't matter. Liesel only knew that Arthur Berg did not have a tyrannical bone in his body, whereas the new leader had hundreds of them. Last year, she knew that if she was stuck in a tree, Arthur would come back for her, despite claiming otherwise. This year, by comparison, she was instantly aware that Victor Kemmel wouldn't even bother to look back. He stood regarding the lanky boy and their malnourished-looking girl. So you want to steal with me? What did they have to lose? They nodded. He stepped closer and grabbed Rudy's hair. I want to hear it. Definitely, Rudy said, before being shoved back, fringe first. And you? Of course. Liesel was quick enough to avoid the same treatment. Victor smiled. He squashed his cigarette, breathed deeply in, and scratched his chest. My gentleman, my whore, it looks like it's time to go shopping. As the group walked off, Liesel and Rudy were at the back, as they'd always been in the past. Do you like him? Rudy whispered. Do you? Rudy paused a moment. I think he's a complete... Me too. The group was getting away from them. Come on, Rudy said. We've fallen behind. After a few miles, they reached the first farm. What greeted them was a shock. The trees they'd imagined to be swollen with fruit were frail and injured-looking, with only a small array of apples hanging miserably from each branch. The next farm was the same. Maybe it was a bad season or their timing wasn't quite right. By the end of the afternoon, when the spoils were handed out, Liesel and Rudy were given one diminutive apple between them. In fairness, the takings were incredibly poor, but Victor Kemmel also ran a tighter ship. What do you call this? Rudy asked, the apple resting in his palm. Victor didn't even turn around. What does it look like? The words were dropped over his shoulder. One lousy apple? Here. A half-eaten one was also tossed their way, landing chewed side down in the dirt. You can have that one too. Rudy was incensed. To H with this. We didn't walk 10 miles for 1.5 scrawny apples, did we, Liesel? Liesel did not answer. She did not have time, for Victor Kemmel was on top of Rudy before she could utter a word. His knees had pinned Rudy's arms and his hands were around his throat. The apples were scooped up by none other than Andy Schmeichel at Victor's request. You're hurting him, Liesel said. Am I? Victor was smiling again. She hated that smile. He's not hurting me. Rudy's words were rushed together and his face was red with strain. His nose began to bleed. After an extended moment or two of increased pressure, Victor let Rudy go and climbed off him. Taking a few careless steps, he said, "Get up, boy," and Rudy, choosing wisely, did as he was told. Victor came casually closer again and faced him. He gave him a gentle rub on the arm, a whisper. Unless you want me to turn that blood into a fountain, I suggest you go away, little boy. He looked at Liesel, and take the little with you. No one moved. Well, what are you waiting for? Liesel took Rudy's hand, and they left, but not before Rudy turned one last time and spat some blood and saliva at Victor Camel's feet. It evoked one final remark. A small threat from Victor Camel to Rudy Steiner. You'll pay for that at a later date, my friend. Oh no. So Rudy kind of gets in trouble with the new leader of the thieves, no, si Victor Camel. Say what you will about Victor Camel, but he certainly had patience and a good memory. It took him approximately 5 months to turn his statement into a true one. Sketches. If the summer of 1941 was walling up around the likes of Rudy and Liesel, it was writing and painting itself into the life of Max Vandenberg. In his loneliest moments in the basement, the words started piling up around him. The visions began to pour and fall and occasionally limp from out of his hands. He had what he called just a small ration of tools. A painted book, a handful of pencils, a mindful of thoughts. Like a simple puzzle, he put them together. Originally, Max had intended to write his own story. The idea was to write about everything that had happened to him, all that had led him to a Himmel Street basement. But it was not what came out. Max's exile produced something else entirely. It was a collection of random thoughts, and he chose to embrace them. They felt true. They were more real than the letters he wrote to his family and to his friend Walter Kugler, knowing very well that he could never send them. The desecrated pages of Mein Kampf were becoming a series of sketches, page after page, which to him summed up the events that had swapped his former life for another. Some took minutes, others hours. He resolved that when the book was finished, he'd give it to Liesel when she was old enough, and hopefully when all this nonsense was over. From the moment he tested the pencils on the first painted page, he kept the book close at all times. Often it was next to him or still in his fingers as he slept. One afternoon, after his push-ups and sit-ups, he fell asleep against the basement wall. When Liesel came down, she found the book sitting next to him, slanted against his thigh, and curiosity got the better of her. She leaned over and picked it up, waiting for him to stir. He didn't. Max was sitting with his head and shoulder blades against the wall. She could barely make out the sound of his breath, coasting in and out of him, as she opened the book and glimpsed a few random pages. And then there are some of the sketches of Max Vandenberg. No? We have little cartoons, Not the Fuhrer, the Conductor. You can take a look at that, no? You can look at that as we're reading through it. Isn't it a lovely day? Very sad illustrations. Frightened by what she saw, Liesel placed the book back down, exactly as she found it against Max's leg. A voice startled her. Dank schon, it said, and when she looked across, following the trail of sound to its owner, a small sign of satisfaction was present on his Jewish lips. Liesel gasped. You scared me, Max. He returned to his sleep, and behind her, the girl dragged the same thought up the steps. You scared me, Max. Max is so low, eh? I love the characters in this book. Hold on, I'm seeing how long the next chapter is. It's fine. We'll do it. The Whistler and the Shoes. The same pattern continued through the end of summer and well into autumn. Rudy did his best to survive the Hitler Youth. Max did his push-ups and made his sketches. Liesel found newspapers and wrote her words on the basement wall. It's also worthy of mention that every pattern has at least one small bias, and one day it will tip itself over or fall from one page to another. In this case, the dominant factor was Rudy, or at least Rudy in a freshly fertilized sports field. Late in October, all appeared to be usual. A filthy boy was walking down Himmel Street. Within a few minutes, his family would expect his arrival, And he would lie that everyone in his Hitler Youth's division was given extra drills in the field. His parents would even expect some laughter. They didn't get it. Today, Rudy was all out of laughter and lies. On this particular Wednesday, when Lisa looked more closely, she could see that Rudy Steiner was shirtless and he was furious. What happened? She asked as he trudged past. He reversed back and held out the shirt. Smell it, he said. What? Are you deaf? I said smell it. Reluctantly, Lisa leaned in and caught a ghastly whiff of the brown garment. Is that? The boy nodded. It's on my chin, too. My chin! I'm lucky I didn't swallow it. The field at Hitler Youth just got fertilized. He gave his shirt another half-hearted, disgusted appraisal. It's cow manure, I think. Did what's his name? Deutscher? No, it was there? He says he didn't, but he was grinning. Could you stop saying that? Exactly. Lisa, can you stop cursing? She keeps taking the Lord's name in vain. But again, no, see, Rudy's making enemies left and right. His Hitler Youth leader hates him. The leader of the gang of thieves hates him. Like, so many people hate him, no, and they bully him pagyud. So, like, once again, no, the leader of the Hitler Youth kind of made Rudy run and work out in a field that was, before it was muddy, no? But now it was actually had like cow manure all over it because it was freshly fertilized. And so Rudy ended up covered in cow poop. And he had to remove his shirt, no, because it was stained na good with cow manure. And Rudy's kind of getting sick of the bullying. What Rudy needed at this point in time was a victory. He had lost in his dealings with Victor Kemmel. He'd endured problem after problem at the Hitler Youth. All he wanted was a small scrap of triumph, and he was determined to get it. He continued home, but when he reached the concrete step, he changed his mind and came slowly, purposefully back to the girl. Careful and quiet, he spoke. You know what would cheer me up? Liesel cringed. If you think I'm going to, in that state? He seemed disappointed in her. No, not that. He sighed and stepped closer. Something else. After a moment's thought, he raised his head just a touch. Look at me. I'm filthy. I stink like cow-sh or dog-sh. Whatever your opinion, and as usual, I'm absolutely starving. He paused. I need a win, Liesel, honestly. Liesel knew. She'd have gone closer but for the smell of him. Stealing. They had to steal something. No, they had to steal something back. It didn't matter what, it needed only to be soon. Just you and me this time, Rudy suggested. No Kemmels, no Schmeichels, just you and me. The girl couldn't help it. Her hands itched, her pulse split, and her mouth smiled at all at the same time. Sounds good. It's agreed then, and although he tried not to, Rudy could not hide the fertilized grin that grew on his face. Tomorrow. Liesel nodded. Tomorrow. Their plan was perfect, but for one thing, they had no idea where to start. Fruit was out, Rudy snubbed his nose at onions and potatoes, and they drew the line at another attempt on Otto's Strum and his bike full of farm produce. Once was immoral, twice was complete bastardry. So where the H do we go, Rudy asked. How should I know? This was your idea, wasn't it? That doesn't mean you shouldn't think a little too. I can't think of everything. You can barely think of anything. They argued on as they walked through town. On the outskirts, they witnessed the first of the farms, and the trees standing like emaciated statues. The branches were gray, and when they looked up at them, there was nothing but ragged limbs and empty sky. Rudy spat. They walked back through Malking, making suggestions. What about Frau Diller? What about her? Maybe if we say Heil Hitler and then steal something, we'll be alright. After roaming Munich Street for an hour or so, the daylight was drawing to a close, and they were on the verge of giving up. It's pointless, Rudy said, and I'm even hungrier now than I've ever been. I'm starving. He walked another dozen steps before he stopped and looked back. What's with you? Because now Liesel was standing completely still, and a moment of realization was strapped to her face. Why hadn't she thought of it before? What is it? Rudy was becoming impatient. Somance, what's going on? At that very moment, Liesel was presented with a decision. Could she truly carry out what she was thinking? Could she really seek revenge on a person like this? Could she despise someone this much? She began walking in the opposite direction. When Rudy caught up, she slowed a little in the vain hope of achieving a little more clarity. After all, the guilt was already there. It was moist. The seed was already bursting into a dark-leafed flower. She weighed up whether she could really go through with this. At the crossroad, she stopped. I know a place. Okay, so Liesel and Rudy, they're basically looking for something to steal, no? Because Rudy feels bad. And what makes him feel better is if he has a win, if he's successful at something. And they're thieves, and so what will make him happy, what will kind of cheer him up is if they successfully have a stealing mission, no? And Liesel thought of Liesel thought of something. They went over the river and made their way up the hill. On Grand Strasse, they took in the splendor of the houses. The front doors glowed with polish, and the roof tiles sat like topaz, combed to perfection. The walls and windows were manicured, and the chimneys almost breathed out smoke rings. Rudy planted his feet. The mayor's house? Liesel nodded seriously. A pause. They fired my mama. When they angled toward it, Rudy asked just how, in God's name, they were going to get inside. But Liesel knew. Local knowledge, she answered. Local. But when they were able to see the window to the library at the far end of the house, she was greeted with a shock. The window was closed. Well? Rudy asked. Liesel swiveled slowly and hurried off. Not today, she said. Rudy laughed. I'm sorry, I'm drinking water. Okay. I knew it, he caught up. I knew it, you filthy sawmensch. You couldn't get in there even if you had the key. Do you mind? She quickened even more and brushed aside Rudy's commentary. We just have to wait for the right opportunity. Internally, she shrugged away from a kind of gladness that the window was closed. She berated herself. Why, Liesel, she asked. Why did you have to explode when they fired Mama? Why couldn't you just keep your big mouth shut? For all you know, the mayor's wife is now completely reformed after you yelled and screamed at her. Maybe she straightened herself out, picked herself up. Maybe she'll never let herself shiver in that house again, and the window will be shut forever. You stupid sawmensch. A week later, however, on their fifth visit to the upper part of Malking, it was there. The open window breathed a slice of air in. That was all it would take. It was Rudy who stopped first. He tapped Liesel in the ribs with the back of his hand. Is that window, he whispered, open? The eagerness in his voice leaned from his mouth like a forearm onto Liesel's shoulder. Jawal, she answered, it sure is. And how her heart began to heat. On each previous occasion, when they found the window clamped firmly shut, Liesel's outer disappointment had masked a ferocious relief. Would she have had the neck to go in? And who and what, in fact, was she going for? For Rudy? To locate some food? No. The repugnant truth was this. She didn't care about the food. Rudy, no matter how hard she tried to resist the idea, was secondary to her plan. It was the book she wanted. The Whistler. She wouldn't tolerate having it given to her by a lonely, pathetic old woman. Stealing it, on the other hand, seemed a little more acceptable. Stealing it, in a sick kind of sense, was like earning it. The light was changing in blocks of shade. The pair of them gravitated towards the immaculate, bulky house. They rustled their thoughts. You hungry? Rudy asked. Liesel replied, starving, for a book. Look, a light just came on upstairs. I see it. Still hungry, sawmensch? They laughed nervously for a moment before going through the motions of who should go in and who should stand watch. As the male in the operation, Rudy clearly felt that he should be the aggressor, but it was obvious that Liesel knew this place. It was she who was going in. She knew what was on the other side of the window. She said, it has to be me. Liesel closed her eyes tightly. She compelled herself to remember, to see visions of the mayor and his wife. She watched her gathered friendship with Ilse Hermann and made sure to see it kicked in the shins and left by the wayside. It worked. She detested them. They scouted the street and crossed the yard silently. Now they were crouched beneath the slit in the window on the ground floor. The sound of their breathing amplified. "Here," Rudy said. "Give me your shoes. You'll be quieter." Without complaint, Liesel undid the worn black laces and left the shoes on the ground. She rose up, and Rudy gently opened the window just wide enough for Liesel to climb through. The noise of it passed overhead like a low-flying plane. Liesel heaved herself onto the ledge and tussled her way inside, taking off her shoes. She realized was a brilliant idea as she landed much heavier on the wooden floor than she'd anticipated. The soles of her feet expanded in that painful way, rising to the inside edges of her socks. The room itself was as it always was. Liesel, in the dusty dimness, shrugged off her feelings of nostalgia. She crept forward and allowed her eyes to adjust. "What's going on?" Rudy whispered sharply from outside. But she waved him a backhander that meant, "Halt, Moll, keep quiet." The food, he reminded her, "Find the food and cigarettes if you can." Both items, however, were the last things on her mind. She was home, among the mayor's books of every color and description, with their silver and gold lettering. She could smell the pages. She could almost taste the words as they stacked up around her. Her feet took her to the right-hand wall. She knew the one she wanted, the exact position, but when she made it to the Whistler's usual place on the shelf, it was not there. A slight gap was in its place. From above, she heard footsteps. This is the third book Liesel is stealing. No, the first one was The Gravedigger's Handbook. The next one was The Shoulder Shrug from The Bonfire. And then now she's stealing The Whistler from The Mayor's Wife. "The light," Rudy whispered. The words were shoved through the open window. "It's out. They're coming downstairs." There was a giant length of a moment then, the eternity of split-second decision. Her eyes scanned the room, and she could see the Whistler, sitting patiently on the mayor's desk. "Hurry up," Rudy warned her, but very calmly and cleanly. Liesel walked over, picked up the book, and made her way cautiously out. Head first, she climbed from the window, managing to land on her feet again, feeling the pang of pain once more, this time in her ankles. "Come on," Rudy implored her. "Run, run, Chanel." Once around the corner, on the road back down to the river and Munich Street, she stopped to bend over and recover. Her body was folded in the middle, the air half frozen in her mouth, her heart tolling in her ears. Rudy was the same. When he looked over, he saw the book under her arm. He struggled to speak. "What?" He grappled with the words. "What's with the book?" The darkness was filling up truly now. Liesel panted, the air in her throat defrosting. "It was all I could find." Unfortunately, Rudy could smell it, the lie. He cocked his head and told her what he felt was a fact. "You didn't go in for food, did you? You got what you wanted." Liesel straightened then and was overcome with the sickness of another realization. The shoes. She looked at Rudy's feet, then at his hands and at the ground all around him. "What?" he asked. "What is it?" "Saw Curl," she accused him. "Where are my shoes?" Rudy's face whitened, which left her in no doubt. "They're back at the house," she suggested. "Aren't they?" Rudy searched desperately around himself, begging against all reality that he might have brought them with him. He imagined himself picking them up, wishing it true, but the shoes were not there. They sat uselessly, or actually much worse, incriminatingly by the wall at 8 Grand Strasse. "Dump cough," he admonished himself, smacking his ears. He looked down shamefully at the sullen sight of Liesel's socks. Idiot! It didn't take him long to decide on making it right. Earnestly, he said, "Just wait," and he hurried back around the corner. "Don't get caught," Liesel called after him. But he didn't hear. Oh, he left her shoes in the scene of the crime, and he's going back to get it for her. I love this book. I love this book because of Rudy, and I love this book because of Rudy and Liesel Good. Are you kilig? Are you feeling the kilig? The minutes were heavy while he was gone. Darkness was now complete, and Liesel was quite certain that Ovachin was most likely in the cards when she returned home. "Hurry," she murmured, but still Rudy didn't appear. She imagined the sound of a police siren throwing itself forward and reeling itself in, collecting itself. Still, nothing. Only when she walked back to the intersection of the two streets in her damp, dirty socks did she see him. Rudy's triumphant face was held nicely up as he trotted steadily toward her. His teeth were gnashed into a grin, and the shoes dangled from his hand. He got her shoes! They nearly killed me, he said, but I made it. Once they'd crossed the river, he handed Liesel the shoes, and she threw them down. Sitting on the ground, she looked up at her best friend. Dank, she said, thank you. Rudy bowed, my pleasure. He tried for a little more. No point asking if I get a kiss for that, I guess. For bringing my shoes which you left behind. Fair enough, he held up his hands and continued speaking as they walked on, and Liesel made a concerted effort to ignore him. She'd only heard the last part. Probably wouldn't want to kiss you anyway, not if your breath's anything like your shoes. You disgust me, she informed him, and she hoped he couldn't see the escaped beginnings of a smile that had fallen from her mouth. Liesel got kilig. She got kilig, no? They've been friends with Rudy for a super long time now, but like, I don't know, they're growing up and things are developing. Like, when he asks for a kiss, she kind of smiles na a little bit. Because he does sweet things for her, like he went back for her shoes. On Himmel Street, Rudy captured the book. Under a lamppost, he read out the title and wondered what it was about. Dreamily, Liesel answered, just a murderer. Is that all? There's also a policeman trying to catch him. Rudy handed it back. Speaking of which, I think we're both slightly in for it when we get home. You especially. Why me? You know, your mama. What about her? Liesel was exercising the blatant right of every person who's ever belonged to a family. It's all very well for such a person to whine and moan and criticize other family members, but they won't let anyone else do it. That's when you get your back up and show loyalty. Is there something wrong with her? I love this. I love that Liesel can talk as much smack about Rosa as she wants to, but once Rudy kind of starts talking smack about Rosa, Liesel feels the need to defend her. Rudy backed away. Sorry, Somenj, I didn't mean to offend you. Even in the night, Liesel could see that Rudy was growing. His face was lengthening. The blonde shock of hair was darkening ever so slightly, and his features seemed to be changing shape. But there was one thing that would never change. It was impossible to be angry at him for long. Anything good to eat at your place tonight? He asked. I doubt it. Me neither. It's a shame you can't eat books. Arthur Berg said something like that once, remember? They recounted the good old days for the remainder of the walk. Liesel often glancing down at the Whistler, at the grey cover and the black imprinted title. Before they went into their respective homes, Rudy stopped a moment and said, Goodbye, Somenj, he laughed. Good night, book thief. He called her book thief. I really like this chapter. What's the name of this chapter? The Whistler part. What was that? The Whistler and the Shoes. Can we read that part again? I love the description even where she kind of noticed nga Rudy's face was starting to change. She started to look more like a young man now. And I love the line where what didn't change is that she wouldn't stay mad at him for long. They're so shit. Of course, Death does this. Of course, in this, because this part, guys, it started with the spoiler about Rudy's death. And now, we know he's gonna die in 2 years. And now they're giving us all the killing parts. Before they went into their respective homes, Rudy stopped a moment and said, Goodbye, Somenj, he laughed. Good night, book thief. It was the first time Liesel had been branded with her title, and she couldn't hide the fact that she liked it very much. He branded her, he named her. As we're both aware, she'd stolen books previously, but in late October 1941, it became official. That night, Liesel Meminger truly became the book thief. Favorite chapter so far, man. Okay. Click on the next video or audio to continue.